A very dangerous part of paranoia, of persecution, indeed a mob mentality itself, is that the most effective use of discrimination is when there is the smallest kernel of truth in what you're saying. Regardless of what you believe, whatever you have faith in, someone but only need justify that belief to the smallest degree with the most flimsiest of truthful information, and they are halfway to convincing you that you not only must persecute those who don't believe what you do, but you must also attack those who would say you are wrong for doing it. The Drumhead, in my opinion, is really a character examination of three different characters. Picard, the initial suspicious observer who wants to find the criminal but finally recognizes when the legitimate suspicion becomes a witch hunt. Worf, who ultimately wants to protect what he feels is important and is blinded by a toxic element that uses his goodwill against him. And then, of course, Satie, a person who believes that anyone that hides something is guilty. That believes anyone who doesn't go along with her 100% in her ideals, in her methods, is against her, and she wants the world fashioned in what she thinks it should be. Ironically, I don't think any of these characters at their core are bad people. I think they want what's best for the Federation and believe that they are doing what needs to be done to preserve their society. So let's break that down. The episode begins with the Enterprise crew investigating a possible spy. A person from the Klingon Empire has recently been on the Enterprise, and it was determined that the Romulan Star Empire was able to garner information that could only be obtained from the Enterprise itself, or, well, it's most likely comes from there anyway. It's really interesting to watch the tools that the Enterprise crew utilize at the beginning. The investigation involves the use of Troy and her telepathic abilities, along with Riker asking questions. The Klingon is closely monitored after the breach and confined to his quarters. The tools being used against him seem completely legitimate for the crime that he is suspected of. Everything at this point is reasonable. It's worth noting, though, this man is still technically innocent. He has not been found guilty in a court of law. However, the crew, especially Worf, treat him as if he's already guilty, as if he's already been found that way from a court. Of course, the Klingon is not a part of the Federation, nor is he a part of the crew, but it's curious how people treat him versus the rights that will be fought for at a later point of Tarsus. At the same time all of this is happening, a part of the warp drive explodes. Investigations into the accident determine initially that there's no reason for this to be an accident, that it could not have occurred without outside help. It appears to be sabotage and of course appears to be linked to the suspected spy. Information has already been passed to the Romulan Star Empire, and now the flagship has been sabotaged. This really seems up the alley of something the Romulan Star Empire would do. Though it does make me wonder. The Enterprise D is crippled, and they believe the Romulans have done this for some reason. Why aren't there more vessels there for support and protection? This would be a prime time to attack and destroy the Enterprise. I mean, in response to this, we only see an Oberth and Excelsior, and that's to transport a former admiral and current head of security. The Enterprise D is a sitting duck. It seems like Starfleet did not take it as seriously as the episode wants us to believe. But anyway. With the possibility of a larger Romulan conspiracy, former Admiral Satie arrives in an Oberth-class ship. Fitting. She begins immediate investigations into the Klingon spy and the engine malfunction. Worf is ultimately able to determine how the Klingon spy was able to hide the information he obtained and get it off ship. Satie takes an immediate shine to Worf after this discovery. She aligns herself with him quite easily. At this point, we see how Worf is taken in by her bravado, her passion, and her cause. After all, she's wanting to ensure the safety of the Federation and the prosecution of anyone that would do it harm. How can you not get behind that? Again, the suspect is proven to be guilty at this point, and how he got the information off the Enterprise is determined. So Worf wanting to push with her and continue down this rabbit hole makes sense. But I want to pause for a minute. After we've determined who the Klingon spy is and how he got the information off, it leaves the engine explosion still unexplained. However, I don't think what we see happens with Picard, Worf, and Satie here can be understated. If we remove the Klingon spy, the thought of a possible sabotage would be a plausible explanation and in the top 5 reasons true, but I doubt that Picard nor Worf would be so apt to focus on that as the only option, if not for the spy. At this point, Satie is able to manipulate both Picard and Worf and keep them singularly focused on what is a possible explanation, but one far from proven. It's interesting how Satie uses an event to keep people looking at something in the way she wants them looking at it. If the road to hell is paved with good intentions, I believe this is where the first brick will be laid for this episode. Right here. During the investigation of the suspected spy, a young man by the name of Tarsus was extremely scared, and it was determined that he was lying about something. When we look to how Picard reacts to this information, he is resistant to further investigation. He doesn't want to push too hard into Tarsus. Tarsus hasn't committed a crime that they know of after all, and he does have rights. We don't see the whole story, but Picard and Riker seemed far less concerned about the rights of the Klingon. Now, it's possible that they were observing them, but to be fair, the Klingon also wasn't a Federation citizen, and it was a legitimate inquiry. But still, Picard was alright with the tools that were used against someone not in his in-group. That could be me looking a bit too much into it, but I still wanted to put it out there for you guys to consider. When we look at Worf and Satie, they've both moved to a stance that Tarsus must have his innocence proven, not his guilt. He's no longer innocent till proven guilty to them. For Satie, it's always been like this, but Worf slowly has moved into her camp. Without even realizing it, they were now going after a young man, even though their inquiry was questionable at best. Now, it is possible to argue that investigating why the man is nervous and what he's lying about is legitimate. It was determined that he was lying during a legal proceeding, and it's still a possibility that there's a saboteur on board. That's sketchy, but still fair enough. However, my point is the intent behind their actions. They wanted to find him innocent to prove he's not guilty, not the other way around. They were after him, not the truth. And again, we continue one brick right after the other. Where we go from morally questionable to outright wrong occurs when Geordi and Data determine that the warp core incident was an accident. It wasn't sabotage. However, even with this information, Satie and indeed even Worf want to move forward going after Tarsus. There's now no crime that needs to be investigated. But the damning thing is, the really scary thing, it's not completely unreasonable. Sure, Tarsus didn't sabotage the Enterprise, but the man is lying. He is hiding some secret. What could he possibly be hiding that is so disturbing to him? If he is a spy for the Romulan Star Empire, then he could do an insurmountable amount of damage to Starfleet and the Federation. And if he isn't a defector, then what he's hiding doesn't really matter. It's really easy to go along with this line of thought when you wrap yourself in the flag and protection of innocent lives. And then another brick. Satie opens the hearings up to the public. After all, we wouldn't want rumors to spread, and if he's innocent, why would he care? There's nothing that brings justice like a mob, all watching the guilty having to prove their innocence. As we know, it's always worked really well for the Cardassians. But the hits keep on coming as Satie's cohorts lie to Tarsus, leading him to believe that the chemicals he had access to were used to sabotage the Enterprise. What is meant to be an investigation was now more an inquisition, an attack on Tarsus. Anything was valid, all to find out his sin. You see, it's okay if Satie and her cohorts lie. They're the good guys, and so they push him, and ultimately, we find that Tarsus has sinned. He's fell short of the glory of God. He lied on his application and had Romulan blood in him. Now, something that I feel gets glossed over, and I don't think that should be understated. Tarsus did do something wrong. He broke the law. Whether this is something that should be a law isn't necessarily relevant in the discussion. Tarsus was a criminal to a degree, and this investigation discovered him. But at what cost? He was considered guilty and not innocent before the truth was discovered. The mob mentality had been put into full effect. His life was being pillaged, and while all of this may have still been legal, it certainly wasn't following the spirit of the law. So was it worth it? Here's a bonus question. Would it have been worth it if this man had been an actual spy? Now, for my money, no. I don't think a society that is willing to persecute 100 innocent men to find one guilty man has ever prospered. But the funny thing is, it wouldn't stop with Tarsus. We plainly see that Worf was happy to do the bidding of Satie now. It is not enough to simply determine the man's secret. His affiliations are important as well. We see them scouring his past and even looking into his brother. No, Tarsus is guilty, and so everyone around him must be searched, especially his family. There is no guiltier man than one who associates with those who are guilty. And when Picard comes to his senses, he finally stands against this. The final brick to hell is laid, in my opinion. Picard is put on trial. I mean, why would you disagree with someone wanting to protect the Federation? Why would you associate with a known liar, someone who shares the blood of a Romulan? Guilt by association, thought crime, all warranted in this day and age. Only a Nazi would defend the legitimate rights of a guilty person. Only a Romulan sympathizer would think that a guilty man deserves rights and should have the legal protections as everyone else. After all, you aren't free from the consequences of your thoughts. And if you believe wrongthink, if you do something horrendous, then you aren't, if you'll forgive the irony here, human. You aren't worth the rights that were granted to you. And another disturbing thought, Satie's influence and her ability to raise fear and alarm in the people was far-reaching. She was so influential that the head of Starfleet security arrived. I've stated it already, but what I love about this episode is I honestly don't believe that anyone here is meaning to do ill, that they want to hurt someone. I think they're trying to do what they think is best. And Picard shows how good intentions can really hurt a society. When discussing this episode, a lot of people will get into the minutiae of what is happening without considering a lot of the context or what is going on. Remember, within this time frame, the Drumhead occurs after the massacre at Wolf 359, possibly by a couple of years. It's important to know that while Starfleet begins to take their role as a military organization much more seriously, they never fully embrace that role until, in my opinion at least, the Battle of the Sacrifice of Angels. The Federation was still coming out of its egotistical fog of considering themselves undefeatable. The transition was occurring, don't get me wrong, but they had a long way to go. Case in point, this episode starts with the confirmation of an intelligence breach on the Enterprise D and the possible sabotage of the warp core of the flagship. You see the duality of the situation. The crew are taking the possibility of a saboteur very seriously. The interrogation is done systematically with all the tools available to them, and the investigation is extremely thorough and methodical. However, pair this with the operations of the ship. It is glossed over and we see a complete lack of security on the ship overall. Remember, the Enterprise is left heavily impaired. The ship is running on impulse power only with the warp core out of commission. We know that Starfleet most likely now powers its phasers through the warp core directly, allowing for a massive amount of firepower. Even if we accepted that the Enterprise had conductors that would store the energy for the phasers, once the first volley occurs, the reactors would be pushed to their max to get anything near what would be required to take down a ship like, let's say a D'Deridex vessel. The warp core also generally powers most all aspects of the ship, and now all of those systems are being powered by a generator that can't generate anywhere near what the warp core can. Their power is extremely limited. It's like running a nuclear submarine on backup batteries and expecting it to be able to take on other vessels that are running at 100% capacity. From everything I can see, the Enterprise has sent no other support craft. It is believed that this sabotage and information was all orchestrated by the Romulan Star Empire. Now, you could try to argue that the Enterprise is possibly deep within Federation territory, but let me say this. If I'm Starfleet security, the nearest Starfleet ships to the Enterprise D would be ordered back for support, and the Enterprise herself would be directed to the nearest starbase. Depending on how far that starbase is, it might even be towed at high warp under heavy escort. The Romulans aren't above playing some long game, even within Federation territory, especially given the utilization of, cloaking technology. And not just that, when you look at the operations on the Enterprise, it's as equally distressing. The ship is running as if there wasn't a care in the world. There are no guards posted with the possible saboteur, nor any guards at critical systems like the transporters, shuttle bays, bridge, and engineering. And this is really remarkable. We see time and again where technology like transporters have been utilized to cause all kinds of hell. And there's no concern? With the ship so crippled, it should at least be running on yellow alert with non-essential crew remanded to their quarters. All systems would be powered on an as-needed basis. Transporters, holodecks, shuttle bays, and other systems would be powered down with a focus on life support, shields, weapons, and propulsion. Again, this is just bizarre to me. They definitely treat the trials and investigation with the mentality of a military, but the policies and defensive measures are not there yet. Moving forward into the actual episode, as stated, secrets of Starfleet have found their way into the hands of the Romulan Star Empire. It's tracked back to having originated from the Enterprise D. At about the same time, the warp core is disabled, and it appears that these two events are linked. After a brief investigation, it is determined that the possible spy is a Klingon exchange officer. We begin with the interrogation of the officer, and I'll be honest, I find it pretty intriguing. Riker asks the Klingon officer why he was accessing the computer for detailed specifics on the warp drive. The officer, of course, denies it, and Riker counters that the computer logged his use of a console and what he accessed. Now here's an interesting side note. This does show that all of the personnel on the Enterprise are being monitored. The computer was able to directly pinpoint where the Klingon officer was and what he was doing. Big Brother, of course, is always out there. It's curious to watch the interaction as well. The Klingon officer is very stoic. That is, until he is accused of something that he didn't actually do, sabotaging the warp core. It's at this point he becomes very animated. And in juxtaposition, it's interesting to watch how somber both Riker and Troi respond. They don't let their emotions out. They don't give anything to the spy about how they're feeling. And then the attempt of a trump card comes out on the part of the accused. The Klingon calls Troi and Riker racists. Man, thank God we don't have to deal with that in the real world. For simply giving legitimate inquiries into something that doesn't make sense, for simply asking why, for simply choosing to not listen and believe, Troi and Riker are called racists. Glad we're in a current year and don't have to deal with that mess. However, there's no worries here. Troi tells him that she's not a racist. Her best friend is black. No, seriously, her retort is stupid. Not that you can really adequately defend against being called a racist. I mean, the reason it's done is to shut down conversation after all. But still, the chief of security being Klingon doesn't impact whether Troi and Riker are actually racist. Riker may have some sway, true, but Troi would have no ability to change who is the chief of security. And I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that there are people within the military that are racist against other people that they have to serve with. And yeah, I get it, keyboard warriors. Before you type actually, I get that he's actually calling them xenophobic. However, it's obvious that this is a stand-in for racism. So you'll forgive me for using racism instead of xenophobia. Ultimately, the conversation goes nowhere. The Klingon denies all of the allegations and gives no reasonable explanation for the circumstantial evidence against him. He requests to be sent home and is advised that after the investigation is completed, he will be returned to the Klingon High Council. Once he leaves, we see how Troi has utilized her empathic ability to try and gauge if he is telling the truth or not. Now note, this is the same technique utilized by Satie. At least utilized by Satie in the beginning. Satie's Betazoid only utilizes empathy at the beginning. It's possible he actually reads the mind of the accused at a later time, though we have no conclusive evidence of such behavior. But we'll get into that soon enough. Back to focusing on Troi, it's interesting how everyone is on board with the use of her abilities. Picard will ultimately change his mind on this, but I sincerely wonder if he meant he's changing his mind when it comes to Federation citizens and not those within the Federation, if he's going to treat both the same. After the interrogation, the Klingon officer would be taken back to his quarters by Worf. During this time, the alleged spy would try to entice Worf to help him escape, and in return, he would ensure Worf's name is known in the Empire. Worf beats the holy hell out of him. Now, in theory, this probably should have ended his Starfleet career, though we've never seen that happen in other instances, so maybe it's okay to rough up your prisoners. The higher-ups just look morally down on you and scoff while giving you a promotion. After all, facts don't matter to what you consider is morally right. Again, I've stated this before, but watch how they treat the Klingon spy. He's being watched, looked down upon, roughhoused. It's quite likely this man is guilty, and they have legitimate tools to watch him. Everyone is okay with what is going on. Even the audience is generally alright with everything that happens to this person. But that's going to slowly change. The next event is the arrival of retired Admiral Nora Satie. There are a few things to this. First, we are told that she is the one that uncovered the conspiracy by a parasitical life form to overthrow Starfleet Command and conquer the Federation in the TNG episode Conspiracy. Except, she's never seen nor mentioned in that episode. And it was quite obviously Picard and Riker who determined the invasion was occurring. Now, it's possible that maybe after these events, while Picard and Riker were put in jail for mutiny and murder of high-ranking officials, that she was able to determine what occurred and to the extent that the parasitic creatures had infiltrated the Federation. But beyond that, this appears to be retconning of the highest order. Her arrival, again, shows the lax nature of the Enterprise D crew for what is a critical situation. When she is transported aboard, Picard offers to take her to her quarters. She rightly points out that they've brought back a retired admiral for sabotage aboard the flagship of Starfleet. She needs to get to work immediately. The damage to the engine is extensive. At least 2 people were hurt, and the barriers were brought down to prevent radiation from leaking onto the rest of the ship. From everything that can be seen, the explosion occurred due to the articulation frame. which is exactly some of the information that was stolen and given to the Romulans. There are a few issues here, of course. First, the Romulans, as far as we know, didn't know about the articulation frame, so how did they sabotage it? They needed the schematics to know more about it. Additionally, the crew believes that the fact that there weren't any issues before a very small gap of time means that there is more credibility to sabotage. Except, that's just speculation. Again, I'll discuss this at a later point, and I brought it up in the other video, but if not for the spy, they would keep sabotage as a possible option, but it wouldn't be considered anywhere near as plausible as it is at this moment. And please hear me out, I don't find it unreasonable that they're this focused in on it, but I think it will become unreasonable at a later point. The last piece of this video that I'll be discussing is the conversation between Satie and Picard. Honestly, I think this discussion is simply brilliant. It shows how effective the fear of the Romulans are. Not the actual threat of the Romulans, but just fear of them. The conversation is less than 3 minutes, but it is extremely powerful. Picard starts out by saying it's disconcerting that a Klingon would assist the Romulans. The conversation then goes into Picard discussing how he's come across circumstantial evidence of a possible Klingon-Romulan alliance. Satie says that Starfleet is well aware of these issues. It's very brief, but it's something that we need to focus on. The Romulans haven't done much in the way of actual work, but they are already dividing even strong allies. They are able to make Starfleet suspicious of its friends, if not itself. It's subtle, but the captain of the flagship and an admiral brought out of retirement are considering that perhaps the Klingons are moving against them, which is exactly what the Romulans want. They want discord and disunity. And again, thank God in 2019 we don't have to worry about a foreign power working on our social media to begin to divide the base so that there is nothing but infighting and vying for power, which ultimately weakens our great nation as our politicians blame each other and try to use the legal system to bring down the other, ultimately crashing the nation into such turmoil that allows the foreign power to do whatever it wants and is going to bring civil war upon us all. Before going too much further, I want to address a few comments that I am seeing consistently in this breakdown. The first is that we don't see security officers on the Enterprise because of electronic security. The computer can detect issues and respond appropriately. This is fair enough, except the computer and electronic systems can be easily fooled or deactivated. I mean, we see it time and again. If it is the case that the Enterprise didn't utilize security personnel because of a reliance on the computer, then it only pushes further how egotistical Starfleet is. Most major powers, and especially the Romulans, would have countermeasures for Starfleet security systems. Additionally, many have tried to call Satie racist and bigoted. In a lot of instances, this appears to be because of the person's own history of having to deal with malice and just placing it onto her. In fact, some are so passionate they have called me dishonest and not labeling her as such. I see no evidence that Satie is actually a racist, nor a bigot. She is a person consumed by fear. When you watch her, she easily shifts from person to person, finding fault and cause to be alarmed based on her needs and her fears. She uses whatever is present to damn a person, whether it be the blood in their veins, their beliefs, or even their history. She attacks Tarsus, Picard, Worf, and even mildly Beverly. It is possible that she's a racist or speciest, but again, I don't think we have enough evidence here to prove that. Moving on to the episode proper, Worf arrives after conversation between Satie and Picard to discuss the investigation. Curiously, when you watch the interaction between Satie and Worf, the facial expressions are done extremely well. You can see that when she identifies him as a Klingon, she is immediately suspicious, distrusting. Though, again, this appears to be her modus operandi as I've discussed before. We have a Klingon spy for the Romulans, and now another Klingon is just walking in. She seems to be a creature of trying to connect things that aren't necessarily connected. Worf advises them he figured out how the spy had gotten the information and how it was transported off the ship, utilizing a specialized hypo syringe. The explanation is, of course, tech and not required for this breakdown, but one important line to listen to here is that when Worf states that the hypo syringe could be utilized without a person's knowledge, Satie counters him by saying that perhaps the person would have known. that it was with their knowledge. It's subtle, but even here you can see that she is looking for conspiracy upon conspiracy. No explanation ever seems to be enough for her. Satie puts Worf in charge and is extremely excited that he will be assisting, taking an instant shine to him. With him now doing her bidding, she's back to trying to find her form of the truth. Again, listen to the wording in this scene before it moves on. She states that they are doing an interrogation of the spy. An interrogation. She's not corrected either, not by Picard nor Worf. When you think about it, this is slightly concerning, especially during this point in Starfleet's history. Interrogating someone isn't really Starfleet's way, at least not right now. Both Picard and Worf would generally balk at the thought of Starfleet officers, quote-unquote, interrogating someone. This was to be an inquiry, an investigation, not an interrogation. At worst, it's his court case. Interrogation is a word utilized by a dictator and evil government, like, say, the Romulans. I know a few people might take issue with me pointing this out, but I sincerely think this all does bear consideration. The Picard and Starfleet of this era would not state that they are interrogators. During the interrogation, Worf puts the screws to the spy. I think it's interesting what we see Worf say here and the implications of it. Worf states that he has tracked every person that has arrived and left the Enterprise since the spy has been on board. He notes that he specifically tracked a Tarkanian diplomat that disappeared without a trace. We do see Worf do this type of investigation again with Tarsus. It's curious though. With the spy, it's okay, but with Tarsus, everyone feels it's different. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that what Worf is doing here is wrong, but it's that slow fade that I've been discussing. It all starts with legitimate threats and legitimate counters to take care of those threats. However, with the right influence, we just continue moving that line until we're going after everyone we disagree with for everything they've ever done. We'll see this behavior later and I'll reiterate it then, but right now, this is a legitimate tracking of other people and movements. But ultimately, Worf will begin looking at what a person did as a child, not looking for the truth and to safeguard the Federation, but to punish someone and give a false sense of security. Luckily, in 2019, we don't have people on both sides going after others for what they did 30 to 40 years ago. That would just be crazy. Back to the investigation, the Klingon would ultimately admit his guilt but deny sabotaging the warp core. The Betazoid states that the man was now telling the whole truth. In my first video, I discussed how one brick builds right onto the other. I stated that a brick was being built right here. What's impressive to me is the force of personality. Satie is so respected and watched that it is her view that is all that matters. After the confirmed spy is taken away, Satie points out that there is another saboteur on board and Picard's issue is much larger than it appeared before. That's the only option that is considered at this point. Everyone believes there are two spies on the ship, no other explanations. The force of personality here is startling. No one really thinks about this logically. Yes, it is possible there are two spies on board. The link is also insinuated to be the Romulans, but ask yourself this. Are the Romulans really that stupid? I'm not saying that you couldn't make an argument that there were two spies and it would be better in some respects to have them, but it doubles the chances of getting caught. It's an unnecessary risk when you've been able to successfully get a spy on board already. Additionally, look at the situation. The Romulans are getting information about the Enterprise and then sabotage it. Why? They never make a move on the Enterprise. We don't know of any other ships having these issues at the moment. It's never thought that they are jumping the gun here? Never considered that perhaps there was something else going on. And additionally, two spies from two different governments getting caught at the same time is highly unlikely. Again, everyone is focused on what Satie is telling them. They don't really question the situation. Hell, they don't question Satie herself. It's the threat to what they hold dear that's pushing them. And so, the investigation would continue. We will get a brief exploration of the character Satie and her interactions with Picard. In this, we see that her father really did her a disservice. He required her to try to live up to more than she was. I like this link because it gives us a possible brief introspection into the character of Satie herself. That people who push for fear and see conspiracy around every corner have demons of their own. They are people. It's easy to look at Satie, or hell, anyone who is pushing fear, and get angry and call them a villain. But they're all people, with their own backstories as well. The next interaction is one that's more telling of Worf's character, and I hate that I did not include it in my first video breaking down his character. Ultimately, the scene discusses the Klingon spy's interactions and setting up for interviews. Interestingly, the question of Worf's loyalty and that of his father being a Romulan collaborator is brought up. Worf states point blank that such information isn't anyone's business. It's not relevant. There's a right to privacy. The irony in the statement from Worf that associations aren't relevant is palpable. It also shows that he has not yet been completely sucked into the machinations of Satie. And there is some legitimacy to what he is trying to do here. I'm going to take a moment to address a common argument that comes up as well. Many will try to justify all of this, especially when it comes to the rights of Tarsus, by saying it's a military ship, that Starfleet is using military law. Starfleet military law, especially during the Next Generation, is sketchy at best. We can't be completely sure what is and isn't legal. We don't exactly know what laws or rights one may have. Presumably, they have some rights at least, as Tarsus is granted constitutional protections. I could also bring up that old chestnut of Picard stating that Starfleet is not a military and go over episodes, even within this season, that would back this opinion up. However, I think that would be dishonest because while there are some inconsistencies, I do believe that Starfleet had started moving into a role of a military here. Now, they'll never truly get there until the Dominion War, but at least they're moving in the right direction. So would they operate like how a military would, or would they still try to be civilian to some degree? I'm honestly not sure, but would lean civilian given how Picard defends everything from a more civilian point of view. Though I'll admit it's debatable. The last discussion will be the two quote-unquote interviews that we see. The first with Beverly Crusher, the next with Simon Tarsus. I want to take a moment here because some people will use this scene as an example of the racism or speciesism of Satie. With Beverly, we see that she is relaxed, comfortable with what is going on. Given that she is the chief medical officer, her probable experience and knowledge of the senior staff, she's pretty laid back. Relaxed. She's also innocent of any crime, so there's no reason to be worried. But I want to note here, we don't see the entire interview. We come in partially through. We don't know the questions that occurred before what we see. I honestly think it's likely that she was asked where she was born and if she was human. Why? Because you need a baseline. We know that the Betazoid isn't reading thoughts, but is reading emotions. So it might be necessary to understand and listen to what they think is the truth versus what is not. That seems the most likely, but again, I don't know. What are your thoughts? The two interviews here are pretty benign. I'd break down the interview with Tarsus, but there's not a lot going on. And it may come in later and we'll reference back to it when it does. After Tarsus leaves, Satie and the Betazoid state that they can stop searching. This man is clearly lying. This is probably where the split from reasonable to unreasonable starts. They focus in on Tarsus, which, let's be honest, is probably the best thing that could have happened if there was another spy. Tarsus is lying, and he is on a military ship. We have possible sabotage and a spy on board if it was sabotaged. Fair. But to go all in on one person because he was nervous and lying? It's drastic, it's folly, it's dangerous. And had there been an actual spy on the Enterprise, it could have gotten everyone killed. But all of this is nothing compared to the investigation and witch hunt to come. The last time we touched on this episode, we discussed the preliminary interviews with Beverly and Tarsus. It was interesting to contrast the ease and comfortable nature of Dr. Crusher versus how scared and worked up Tarsus was. I've already touched on this, but at the end of Tarsus's interview, the empath states clearly that Tarsus is scared and hiding something. Something so big it's overwhelming him. Both the empath and Satie are happy to stop the interviews here and not talk to anyone else, believing they have found the additional spy. I've said it before and I'll say it now. This is incredibly stupid. First, it's going to be discussed, but just because he is hiding something doesn't actually mean that he's done anything wrong. More importantly, just because they think they have their man doesn't mean they should stop. If there is another spy out there, this would give them more time to get away or prepare for the interview. So whether you think investigating Tarsus is appropriate or not, it's moronic to stop here. But stupid or not, they would begin to solely focus on Tarsus himself. After it's clear that Satie has laser focused on Tarsus, Picard directly confronts her. Based on the dialogue, we get the impression that Satie thinks Tarsus should be confined to his quarters and closely monitored. What strikes me in this conversation is how Picard is shown to be an absolute hypocrite. It's subtle, but you do actually see it. Satie will even call him out on it. In the end, Satie is ultimately an outsider from the Enterprise's crew, the Enterprise family. Picard doesn't like using the quote-unquote intuition of Satie's empath, but when the former admiral asks if he would be alright with the decision if it had been made by Deanna Troi, he admits that he would. So really, Picard isn't against holding an innocent man if his in-group and close circle think that it should be done. His morals only begin to come out if an outsider wants to do it to one of his people. Now, to be absolutely fair here, Picard realizes his blinders, his duality, and states that he will question that practice in the future, only to ultimately do exactly this in other episodes. Well, at least he thought about it. Can't win them all, I guess. Back to the conversation proper, they do discuss whether it is right to hold Tarsus for something that is little better than an educated guess. Picard rightly states that the man hasn't done anything, that he was scared when he was put on this mock trial, which is something that could reasonably happen to most people, and that while he is hiding something true, there's nothing that ties him to any sabotage. Satie's position is that there's definitely something odd going on with Tarsus, and it's very dangerous to let someone who may be a threat roam free, especially if we consider that Tarsus now knows he is about to be caught if he is truly guilty. Tarsus is being backed into a corner, so what would a spy who's in this position do? Would he try to escape? What if he feels he can't? How far would he be willing to go to keep his secrets? Would he destroy the Enterprise to ensure that the Romulan Star Empire isn't found out? Honestly, the more I watch this episode and do research into military law, I come to the conclusion that both Satie and Picard are right, and both of them are wrong. Starfleet is finally beginning to realize that it's a military again. Tarsus is a member of Starfleet. Members in the military are held to a different standard, and it is possible that they willingly forego some of their rights in service to their government, queen and country, and all that. Additionally, if Tarsus is a threat, then keeping an eye on him isn't unreasonable. But military or not, he still has rights, both under the Federation Charter and Constitution, as well as whatever uniform code of military justice Starfleet would employ. It's clear, at least to me, that Tarsus is meant to be treated more civilian than military member in the episode. This all just based on the dialogue and the writing. Now, I think that this is a misstep in the plot if there was a goal to show Satie as being completely unreasonable. Instead of having Tarsus be in the military, be in Starfleet, have him be a part of a delegation that was aboard the Enterprise. Have that delegation be from a member world, and with the Enterprise crippled, they can't get them to a starbase. So the investigation begins on the Enterprise under Picard's watch. As a civilian, this all would fall more into line with what they were going for. There's no gray. However, that isn't what occurred. Tarsus is in the military. He is in Starfleet. And for my money, I honestly have to say that I'm more on the side of Satie at this point in regards to what she wants to do. Not necessarily the why, though. If there is a chance that Tarsus is a spy, or is about to damage the ship, then let's go ahead and limit his ability to do so. Restrict him to quarters under guard and monitoring. It's not personal, it's business. And while this may not be what Tarsus wants, I would much rather hurt his feelings than have a warp core breach because a spy decided to throw a rock at the most volatile warp core ever created by man. Unfortunately, we don't know what way Picard will go. The discussion is interrupted by LaForge. LaForge and Data explain that ultimately this explosion was an accident. Something that could not have been detected, caused by the hatch itself. I want to take a moment though to question the choice to make the explosion be an accident. Some in the comments section have spoken about this episode being a play on McCarthyism. We can definitely see that as the episode progresses from this point out. But I'm just going to throw this out there, and I'd love to know your thoughts. It's easy to look at Satie and cast judgment, to say that she's doing the wrong thing, just shake our heads because ultimately she's going after an innocent man. But what if the accident had been sabotage? Bonus points. What if Tarsus was a spy that wanted to destroy the Enterprise? You see, Satie is still wrong in that instance, but it's much harder to stand in judgment if the man was guilty. You can't use the wrong methods to get the truth and it still be a just system. Fighting for Tarsus when he is guilty only helps us defend those who are innocent. I think that if they had went that way, it could have been very powerful to have Picard fight for the rights of a guilty man. That's not to say where they went with this episode was bad. I still like the message. It's still good to take a look at McCarthyism in and of itself, but this could have been a very different episode with very different implications. But that wouldn't be the way of things, however. As stated, it is ultimately determined that the explosion was indeed an accident. If you haven't had a chance to watch the Drumhead, which first, why the hell are you watching this if you haven't? But beyond that, please watch the conversation that occurs after the 21-minute timestamp on Netflix if you don't watch anything else. That entire dialogue perfectly shows our civilization today. If there is a disease in our Western culture, it would have to be the need to attack that which we don't know, fear, or hate, with a disregard to the truth. I've stated it before, but ultimately Satie and Worf are looking to prove a person innocent, not determine if he is guilty. These are two very different concepts, and honestly, it's something that I think we see now all the time, from politics to Star Trek. If a person, an idea, or a show is hated so much, people will listen to anyone who sounds confident and can provide the scantest of quote-unquote proof to back up their point. Our culture is largely not skeptical anymore. People don't look into things if they are presented with something that matches their ideals. They just accept what's put before their eyes. And if the information ultimately is proven to be wrong, if the politician they were listening to, the news anchor, or YouTuber is shown to be just grasping at straws, who cares? The object of hate, the person, show, or idea that they were unreasonably persecuting, is still evil. Because whoever was being attacked, the person, show, or idea that was unreasonably being persecuted is still evil and is probably guilty of something just as aberrant as what they were being accused of. So we'll just keep pushing that. The sad fact is, McCarthyism has never really left us. It's just changed form. Ultimately, the truth matters. The entirety of this episode is about the presumption of innocence, about witch trials, about damning a person for who they are. And yet today, we do the same thing. And the majority of people who do this and are told what they are doing never admit it to themselves. Just a thought. But getting off my soapbox, we see a conversation occurring between Satie, her empath, Picard, and Worf, as I've noted. I've already alluded to this, but the conversation shows the stark differences in the characters. With no evidence of further sabotage, Picard is happy to let the entire thing go. However, Satie and Worf point out that it doesn't actually end here. What's truly scary here is how Satie interweaves legitimate concern with unreasonable paranoia. She does bring up some good points. It is unlikely that the Klingon spy could have done everything he did without help. But on the other hand, it is very unreasonable to completely unravel all of Tarsus's life because you think that Tarsus did it. Is it unreasonable to continue the investigation though? Not necessarily. But it is unreasonable to assume he's guilty and try to prove his innocence. The real meat of this episode, and indeed the breakdown, will be the trial of Tarsus. So I'm going to stop here so that I can have an entire video dedicated to that. Throughout this series, people have thanked me for talking about the ills of the culture but not taking sides. Some have worried that I'm going to get overly political, and some have even accused me of supporting one person over the other. This isn't a political channel, and that's not my intent. But I do believe this episode speaks to us as a people, as a culture. For me, the problem is rarely what a person believes, but how they believe it. Most people are generally moderate and have a good head on their shoulders, but they allow themselves to be pulled into this cult mentality. People don't allow themselves to keep their minds open, and worse, they begin to hate the person for what that person believes. For me, I'd much rather have someone who is wrong on the topic but has an open mind than someone who is right and be an unchanging sycophant. One can be reasonable, the other will believe anything that justifies their assumption. One of the reasons I love doing what I do is because I can explore these themes. Star Trek has the ability to make us question ourselves, and that's one of the reasons I think it's so important to break down the lore. As we discussed beforehand, the conspiracy and need to find another traitor among the crew in their midst will never be as prevalent than it is at this time. Even Picard is reluctantly agreeing to move forward, and Worf has fallen so far that he is searching for a man's innocence not his guilt. Satie will never again have her hooks as far into the crew as she does right now. Even so, cracks can still be felt. Picard has already pointed out a few times that Tarsus still has rights. The next scene is yet another, quote-unquote, informal inquiry, though they do call it a hearing from time to time. However, in this instance, Tarsus is put in front of the crew of the Enterprise. It's open to anyone who wants to come. In previous episodes, I've discussed how this invitation to the, we'll call it public, has been a way of enlisting a mob. I still believe that, but it strikes me on this 70-ish rewatch. Man, I swear to God, I can now quote this entire episode without even having to see it. Anyway, it strikes me how all of this is meant to be a public spectacle. A key point is that this entire affair is not a court proceeding. And even though it's not an official court process, they are still judging the person. It's just now, it's in the court of public opinion. More and more in real life, we see on both sides how when someone is attacked, that the excuse is, this isn't a courtroom, and words and actions have consequences regardless. It's being used over and over. Well, this scene is probably one of the best portrayals of that mentality, in my opinion. When challenged by Picard on making it a public inquiry, Satie states that she is doing it for the public good. It stops rumor and speculation, because why would anyone want to do this entire thing privately? What do they have to hide? If you're innocent, why wouldn't you want to defend yourself in front of everyone? I mean, hell, it's not like just putting an idea out there into the general public harms the person. I mean, people just don't jump on bandwagons and believe it because it's said, and lives aren't irreparably damaged due to a false accusation. Picard would ultimately lose the battle and back off, and the inquiry would continue. Riker is assigned to Tarsus as counsel, against Tarsus's wishes, might I add. It's important to know that this was the right judgment call by Picard and a wrong one by Tarsus. Tarsus constantly says that he's innocent, nothing to hide, so he doesn't need a counselor. Even if that had been true, and Tarsus was 100% innocent, he still needs a counselor. Having a lawyer present doesn't mean you're guilty. It means you're not stupid. Longtime fans of the channel will know that I have a background in criminal justice. Well, it was called pre-law back then, but it's criminal justice. I went to school for a time in that field to get my associates. Now, my bachelor's that I went for went in a different direction, but I do have some experience with the United States legal system. Anyone who has been in any type of serious court case will tell you that the entire thing is basically a game. You hire lawyers not because you've done anything wrong, but because they know the game. Satie is out for blood here, and she's using every advantage she can. This is why Tarsus needs someone on his side. We can see Satie's manipulations pretty easily. This is not an official court hearing, so Satie isn't bound to many regulations. Tarsus is a medical officer as well. He won't be able to adequately defend himself against Satie when she does this for a living. Having a counselor, a lawyer, doesn't ever really make you guilty, just means you're smart. It's a good call on Picard's part, as I said, and it's good that Tarsus has this protection. The next scene is probably in the top 3 of my favorite scenes of this episode, and it has nothing to do with Tarsus. Satie begins asking questions of Beverly Crusher. She wants to know who interacted with the Klingon spy along with Tarsus. It is obvious that Beverly thinks Tarsus is innocent and that this entire affair has gone too far. She challenges Satie on her questioning and tactics, and Satie begins ramping up against her. Honestly, if I was writing this, I would have extended the scene and had Satie just rip into Beverly, who would call her out for having a witch hunt. But even with what we have here, it's obvious that it's not enough that they are going after Tarsus. If you defend Tarsus, or hell, if you think that it's just gone too far, whether Tarsus is guilty or not, all of a sudden, you're in the limelight. It doesn't matter if you care about the innocent until proven guilty, or if you just think that what is being said as truth doesn't make sense. You're now a sympathizer. So get back in line before you suffer the same fate. You know, the Inquisition was one of the darkest times in Catholic history. I sometimes wonder, though, if the difference between those times and the mobs of today is only that the church wasn't more honest about what they were doing. Anyway, me low-key throwing shade so vague that everyone will think I'm agreeing with them and whatever they hate aside. When Picard realizes that Satie is gearing up to go after Crusher, he steps in. Ain't no one gonna attack his baby mama. Picard, rightly, will not allow Satie to pull innocent individuals into the inquiry. With that avenue shut down, she begins to focus solely on Tarsus. In the next scene, Satie allows her protege to start the questioning. As I mentioned before, the fact that this isn't a court case begins working in her favor. If you rewatch the scene, the man, the empath, never allows Tarsus to fully answer the question. He also continues asking questions one after the other, with them only mildly having connections together. This keeps Tarsus off guard and leads him to stumble across his words, saying things that may or may not be true. In a court of law, at least US law, this would never have been allowed to happen. This is a very deceitful tactic to get someone to say something that is incriminating. When you look at how cases are presented, at least in the US, basically, lawyers are creating a presentation for the judge or the jury to show them why their side is right. That's not what this is. This is just an attack. Honestly, I'm surprised Riker didn't shut this down as well. Informal inquiry, or hearing, or not. It's badgering and it's manipulative. Also, and I'll admit that this is probably going too deep into the meaning of the show and probably wasn't the intention of the writers, but even if it wasn't the intention, I think it's important to note. Something to consider here is that what is being thrown against Tarsus, some of it at least, is known not to be true by Satie and her protege. But still, she is having it presented to the public as if it were true. To be specific, it is implied that Tarsus may have given chemicals to sabotage the Enterprise. This is blatantly untrue, but only a very few number of people would know that. And now, this lie is out in the open, and never corrected. The public has it in their mind that this falsehood may be true. And imagine how horrible it will be for Tarsus if the culture of the Federation is to simply listen and believe. Horrifically, Satie and her associates also have plausible deniability in all of this if they get called out. The terms and words were couched very carefully. They utilized words like if or would you be surprised. And again, not being in court, you don't really have to worry about being a liar or being this manipulative. As stated, the idea that Tarsus assisted in sabotaging the warp core is put into the public's eye. And then bam, he's hit with a gut punch. Tarsus is proven to have at least lied once. It is shown that he does not have Vulcan ancestry, but Romulan. Think about that. Think about this manipulation tactic. They took an egregious lie and then combined it with a drastically more benign truth. And so now, the public thinks that Tarsus is guilty of being a spy and sabotage. They tied the truth to a lie to make it seem more accurate. Huh. And even listen to the dialogue as he is attacked. He is accused of honoring his Romulan heritage. Honoring it, which I honestly have my doubts. He seems pretty ashamed of it to me, hiding it, denying it, scared to even be associated with the Romulans. Thank God in 2019's culture, we don't have to be ashamed of being a certain ethnicity or skin color because of the mistakes of our ancestors, am I right? Riker, Tarsus's counsel, advises him to invoke his right to not be incriminated. Which, by the way, he should. I'm going to discuss this more when we look at Worf's actions in the next video, but this is a very important point. Let's not lose the scope. Tarsus is on trial for possibly sabotaging the warp core. They first have to tie him to that sabotage before they can even begin to look into anything further. And for those who are going to say, well, they're just looking into him being a spy, not the warp core sabotage, well, that's not completely true, is it? They specifically go out of their way to put the sabotage on him before calling him out for being a Romulan. They're the one that made it about the warp core, not me. And when you look at what they're trying to look into, whether Tarsus is a spy or he sabotaged the warp core, him lying on his entrance papers, that's outside of the scope of this inquiry, and invoking his right to not incriminate himself is apt. And again, I don't want to get into this too much, but the understanding of this right in the real world has always been a pet peeve of mine. People assume that if you don't want to incriminate yourself, that you're guilty. That simply isn't true. A person could not want to talk due to a myriad of reasons. This could be from something that's embarrassing to not wanting to admit to another crime they've committed. And regardless of if they are guilty of another crime or not is irrelevant. It only matters for the crime at which they are on trial for. A court of law, justice, is about finding the truth, not punishing a person for whatever you can find on them. This entire scene is everything that is wrong with a mentality that has always existed within humans. The need to search out and find a reason for something that has happened, an atrocity, even if it's not that person's fault. The need to put someone on display to have some kind of scapegoat, and then to attack anyone who might even marginally defend them. The need to state a falsity or something people aren't sure of, and then use a truth to tie them together. And unfortunately, it doesn't even end there. And we'll see that when we look into how Worf goes for the jugular. In the last episode, we ended with Tarsus being accused of lying on his entrance papers to the Federation. The man being declared not only a liar, but a criminal. Oh, a criminal not for being a spy or a saboteur, which was the point of the inquiry, but for falsifying documents. It was claimed that Tarsus had Romulan ancestry, not Vulcan. However, I can see the argument for why this could be considered grievous. First, Tarsus hid the fact that he had a Romulan lineage, allegedly at least. The Romulans are an enemy that would see the Federation fractured if they could. But more importantly, Tarsus may have lied. At this point, Starfleet was considering itself a military, and in a military, you have to trust the person next to you. Now, should this be a career ender? I'm inclined not to think so, but I'm open to the conversation, especially if you served. Though I don't think it should be a limiter if you didn't and you still have an opinion, so let me know. With Tarsus taking his guarantee against self-incrimination, Satie's hooks can clearly be seen dug into Worf. Which, side note, why is the tactical and security officer of the flagship now dedicating assets into researching Tarsus? Shouldn't he and his security team stay focused on the security of the Enterprise D and it now be transferred to a starbase, and thus Starfleet intelligence? Just saying. In any case, Worf is now full steam ahead on investigating Tarsus. Again, this entire thing is beyond ludicrous. We don't even have confirmation yet that Tarsus has Romulan ancestry. Remember, he took the guarantee against self-incrimination, but that could be for multiple reasons. Maybe it's related to him having Romulan blood. Maybe it's related to the fact that he can't read and thus just put the wrong name because he was copying something he found on the internet. That's the point of the guarantee. It's so that you don't incriminate yourself. On what is the question? They've already caught the real spy and they know that there is no sabotage. So you can see how insane this is by just removing what can't be utilized against Tarsus. Without the sabotage, all you have is a Klingon spy you know was working for the Romulans. You also have a person with the medical department doing his job that may or may not have lied about his heritage, and then nothing else. There is no evidence that they collaborated, no evidence that Tarsus has ever been a traitor. But none of that matters now. Worf orders his team to begin searching into the last 5 years of Tarsus's life, looking at his friends, his school friends, family. It's not enough for a man to be guilty of something. Oh no, everyone he associated with is as well. And you know, I wish I could say that I found it funny that the writers included Worf wanting polygraph tests as a way of mocking people who act like Worf, polygraphs being notoriously bunk science, and in fact allow sociopaths to pass with flying colors. But I doubt the writers knew it at the time and probably meant this as a legitimate way of finding people who were guilty. Still funny though. The next interaction between Worf and Picard is simply amazing. You can see the distinction between the two people. Now, it's important to remember that both Worf and Picard are the good guys. They're both heroes. Both protagonists wanting to do what is right. However, the divide between them is massive. The show does a wonderful job at distinguishing the differences between who is right and who is wrong. Not only does it do that, but in fact, it's done so well that Worf is written as not even seeing that he is in the wrong. Often in writing and in shows, the character will know that there's something up with the way that they're acting, but they continue to do it, even though they clearly know that for some reason they're not going the way they should be. But in this episode, he doesn't believe he's wrong. And that makes it good writing. And so, because Worf thinks he's doing what is right, Picard has to explain it to him. Worf doesn't see how he has fallen from grace, which is exactly what happens to all of us in the real life if you think about it. No one, generally, knows that they are going against what is morally right. They are just so passionate about it that they are willing to attack anyone as long as the dogma is kept. As stated, Picard begins discussing what is wrong with this entire affair. He goes through what the quote-unquote Drumhead trial is, which, for those who haven't watched the episode in a while, was when military officers would hold their own form of court, with decisions being made quickly and punishments being harsh. It was often done on a, wait for it, drumhead. These cases were all for show though, as the persons brought to the court were basically doomed. And Worf's reaction to being presented to what he is doing is perfect. It completely encapsulates the entire episode and what comes with people wanting to punish others and not caring about what the truth is. Worf states that the Klingon spy was there on board. Picard agrees that the Klingon spy was captured and admitted his guilt. And for that, he would be punished. And then, the most notable thing, cringeworthy by Worf, but so important. Worf states that Tarsus has all but done the same. And why does he say that? because Tarsus took his right to not self-incriminate. Think about that. There is a man that has admitted to being a spy, and then you have a completely different man who is just as guilty as he is, because at best, this guy lied on an entrance exam. Seriously, I would get beyond self-righteous about this right now if it wasn't happening in 2019. How many times are people associated with another person because they don't agree or have committed a lesser act? I mean, hell, you have people today who are being attacked simply because they want to wait for due process before attacking someone. People who have been victims of a crime that they don't want to put on someone else until it's been through court are getting harassed on Twitter because they just won't listen and believe. Alright, now that I got my required commentary that will guarantee unsubs out of the way, focusing back on the show itself, Picard completely shuts down Worf here, explaining association does not mean you are guilty. And he's right, because it doesn't. Worf then only continues to prove how lost he is at the moment, how much he doesn't care. Mr. It doesn't matter what happened with my father and the Romulans, that's a personal matter, tries to utilize the fact that Tarsus opted to use his protections against self-incrimination as a way of showing that Tarsus is guilty of something. And I know I've brought it in a couple of times, but remember, Tarsus never admitted that he had Romulan blood. He pleaded his right against self-incrimination, the seventh guarantee in the Federation's constitution. And while looking at that, this guarantee is most likely based on the Western justice system. And while it's not perfect, most modern justice systems in the Western world are geared towards ensuring that someone who is not guilty stays free. A part of this is not allowing the state to force someone to testify against themselves, or force the defendant to prosecute their own case. In theory, it is extremely tough to put someone in jail. This is the only way to ensure that the average citizen doesn't have to fear an overzealous government. Worf completely personifies the terror that one should fear if a state was allowed to move forward and utilize someone's silence against themselves. Worf has already convicted Tarsus in his mind due to a loose association and an unwillingness to talk. Worf isn't taking the time to find the truth. He just wants to find as many people as he can who he deems as quote-unquote enemies and gets rid of them. The scene is powerful because I think it portrays Worf as basically the everyman, most people we see in social media today. Worf is the person who is watching two titans and being drawn into one side or the other. You have Satie, who wants to go after everyone and everything, and Picard, who thinks that rights actually mean something. You know, I got a lot of comments in my last video about McCarthy, about how he was right, that he took down the Communist Party and he was stopping communist spies. And that very well may be true, I honestly don't know, but at what cost? What I do know about McCarthyism is that innocent men and women were going to jail and being barred in the public's eye. The country may have been safer, sure, but now they had a state that would attack you for what you believe, so is that really worth it? Worf and Satie might make it a lot harder for the Romulans to infiltrate the Federation. However, where does it stop? How does this end? I mean, hell, you would catch far more spies if you remove the innocent until proven guilty provisions as well. Say what you want about the Cardassian justice system, but they have 100% conviction rates. Act of the episode, Tarsus is largely forgotten as Picard becomes the main target of Satie's ire. As has been stated, Jean-Luc had had enough of Satie's attempt to destroy someone for her own holy war. He tells her that he will stop her at all costs. The unfortunate thing about saying that is that sometimes there is a cost you will have to pay. The cost for Jean-Luc would be that she turns the investigation solely upon him. This is something that is so telling of a culture that wants to either be a victim or punish someone. Again, I could give you several examples of people and YouTubers like Sid Alpha that will stand up for a right or a belief. Not that they even like what they are defending, just that they know something has a right to exist, this giving protections to other things that should exist. And for that, they are attacked. It honestly amazes me how timeless this episode is when you take a look at what happens to Picard. Back to the episode at hand, the captain is challenged and brought on trial. Oh, sorry, they called it committee this time. It's hard to tell if it's a hearing, trial, or committee. And can I just take a moment to give kudos to Satie for the bravado she has got to have in bringing the captain of Starfleet's flagship up on charges? But man, I know that Picard is pretty easygoing. However, I don't think he's someone I'd want to exactly challenge unless I knew what I was doing given his influence. As the hearing begins, Picard requests to make a statement, and of course, Satie attempts to shut him down. The captain counters her by quoting the Code of Uniform Justice, and thus will be able to make a statement, which, again, only continues to confirm Starfleet is more and more considering itself a military. I'm not understanding why they continue to jump between what can happen at a civilian court and then trying to have a military hearing. Though, if I'm being fair, I wouldn't be able to write accurately how a military court works either. I'd have to hire someone who has actually been in the military, which they may not have been able to do. With his rights under the Uniform Code clear, Picard discusses everything that has transpired. Now, many people will quote the "with every link the chain is forged" speech that comes after this one. And it's really good, don't get me wrong, but I think this speech that he does right here is probably the best of the episode. He completely lays out the events that have been discussed and how everything has gone from a legitimate investigation to a witch hunt. If I was writing it, the only possible inclusion I wish he had discussed was how dangerous this can be. Now I know, repetitive, but Satie has put the Federation even more in danger than when she started. She is now chasing shadows, phantoms. She's crying wolf way too much. This is dangerous because when she does actually find a threat, who's going to listen to her? In today's age, people we think are guilty are overanalyzed and everything they do is questioned, which basically makes everyone numb to when they actually have committed a crime. I mean, and I'm just throwing this out there, can you think of a potentially high-profile figure that if he misspells something like, let's say, coverage, it is covered by the mainstream media for days? It's so bad that if that person was actually a criminal, the news has called him it so much that no one will believe them if it's ever proven. But back to the speech, Picard goes on to discuss how the entire trial of Tarsus was baseless. He asks Satie to stop, and of course, the Admiral is already too deep in. She can't even hear reason at this point. She then goes to do something predictable but no less scary. She begins to question Picard on his breaking of the Prime Directive. And by the by, of anyone to question if they don't follow the main religion of the Federation, Picard would not be it, lady. Just trust me on that one. However, my warnings aside, Satie would question him on his faith, on his patriotism. But you know, I think what is lost in translation with a lot of people on this action is that Satie is going after Picard for anything that he has done wrong, not even related to their being a spy. But that's exactly how it goes, isn't it? When we can't tie a person to the crime or other person we hate, we simply attack their record. And the sad thing is, there isn't a person alive who hasn't done something aberrant, something unforgivable. So if we don't like a person, think they're a hypocrite, find them unworthy, or want to delegitimize them, we begin scouring their history and looking for reasons not to like them. We find whatever we need to discredit them and bring it up, whether it's been done days ago, years, or even decades. And it doesn't matter if they've atoned. Oh no, if they did it, that's end game. And that's exactly what happens with Picard. He explained everything that happened. He can't be held accountable for what he did, but none of it mattered. We'll get more into that after this. As we discussed, Satie would challenge Picard on his record of the Prime Directive, on his affiliations with choosing to save the Enterprise over capturing a Romulan spy, and placing the deaths of everyone at Wolf 359 on him for being Locutus, all because he disagreed with her. She now makes him look like a traitor, and with all this brought before him, we get the coveted speech known by all. It's always curious to me to search this speech up on YouTube. Regardless of what people believe, they think it applies to those they disagree with. I've seen it as a response to conservatives, response to liberals, response to SJWs, response to feminists and anti-feminists. It's interesting how all of this is painted against those who are thought to be the bad guys. And let's take a look at the speech. With the first link, the chain is forged. The first speech censored, the first thought forbidden, the first freedom denied, chains us all irrevocably. The first time any man's freedom is trodden on, we're all damaged. We all know how this ends. Satie is thrown into a frenzy with her father's words used against her and ultimately loses all legitimacy with a warning from Picard to Worf that they must always look out for her stripe. So I'm not going to be going into that any further. I'm going to be looking at the speech. And unfortunately, this speech, when I was doing my research, can not only be applied today, but be applied 50 years ago. The problem with the speech, with wanting to stop the first chain from being forged, is that it's highly unpopular. The first chain that is forged is usually based on an evil person using their freedoms to hurt the sensibilities of others. While in the episode it was talking about a Romulan spy and then ultimately attacking an innocent man like Tarsus, in real life we need look no further than Europe for an example of this. For instance, to ensure Godwin becomes a part of the discussion, let's consider the Nazi regime. The Nazis were one of the worst aspects of humanity. Hitler and those within his inner circle were probably among the worst human beings on planet Earth. After so much death and destruction, including both the Holocaust and World War II, it would be natural for anyone to not want someone to proclaim how great the Nazis are. Anything that promoted Nazis, especially after the war, would be extremely hurtful and concerning. So by that logic, it makes sense to want to curtail that. However, to tell someone who inaccurately states that Hitler was right that they can't, and again, let me clarify, not a call to action, not to kill people, just to say that Hitler was right. By telling them they can't say that, it's a forging of the chain. And then that chain continues. It continues to be formed and forged until we now have where in the United Kingdom and other places, police departments will arrest you for tweets, even innocuous ones, or for teaching your pug to do a Nazi salute. The point of this breakdown was to analyze the science fiction that we love and to try to bring it into the real world a bit. I honestly think, whether the writers meant to or not, we're talking about situations where we're trying to limit speech, where the chain is being forged. I do think it's a balancing act. I don't think that all speech can be allowed. Again, calls to action, to kill someone or harm someone, shouldn't be allowed. But we have to be careful. It is a thin line where we go from legitimately wanting to defend what we hold dear to stop anyone who would want to cause us harm to attacking the innocent. You know, while rereading this script, the one I'm reading to you right now, I don't know that I'll ever be this blunt again, but I did want to try something new. The Drumhead was one of the best episodes that I think speaks to our culture today. It really is a warning to always be vigilant. But now that I've finished it, be sure to stay tuned for the next long-form series.